This lecture is for INST 222 and it comes from the reading culture clash. When teachers and students come from different backgrounds, they may not speak the same language. The objective is for all of you to be able to understand the impact of culture in the classroom and how it can get in the way of understanding students. And we'll do this through this lecture with 100% participation and comprehension. So here are the key terms that you need to take note of. The reading begins with a little vignette, a little story, if you will, from Miss White in her classroom. So she asked the students, after explaining to them that it is 10 o'clock, she says, "What time is it?" And many of the white children raise their hands, eager to answer, and the black students sit there silently, and a few of them give her a puzzled look. And I can see why Miss White would think that her white students got the answer and that she would have to revisit this concept with her students of color. The real problem here is that she has no understanding of how these kids and from this particular culture group have been sort of acculturated within their own families. Usually when you have kids, and not just black kids, but any kid from lower socioeconomic status, there's this thing that doesn't happen in their homes. Often it doesn't happen, not with every household, but usually they aren't asked questions like, what time is it? What color is it? We know that parents from middle and upper income families, they have a way of acculturating their children to get ready for the world around them. And we find that those kinds of questions usually don't happen in certain households where children come from poor environments. And if Miss White knew that, she would have known that the kids probably knew the answer, but they weren't used to being asked a question, then told what the answer is, and then asked to repeat that line of questioning. That way of asking your young people how to interpret the world doesn't occur the same way in every cultural group. The author tells us on page 17 that for many students, schools are like a spaceship from another planet that just landed in town. And what that means is that these children come from homes or cultural environments where things that are done and the behaviors and belief and value systems may be different from what's going on in schools. And we have to remember that schools are a reflection of mainstream society that are reflected by the dominant culture, and we have to look to our Anglo brothers and sisters who helped create this institution known as education. Anglos have created most all of the institutions in the United States, whether we're talking about medicine or law, politics, education, what have you. Our white brothers and sisters founded these institutions. Therefore, these institutions reflect their ways of doing things. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. We can look to any cultural group around any country in the world and find, for example, that their culture reflects their institutions and vice versa. You know, if we go to China, you'll find that their ways of doing things can be seen in law and politics and medicine and even in their educational system. Now, the problem for us in the U.S. is that we don't have one dominant culture now. We have many different cultures that need to be observed and respected and reflected inside our schools and our schools' curricula. For me, there are 14 major points that I want to share with you all. The first point is that um, culture, if you're not aware of the differences in culture, can create an invisible wall that stands in the way of learning and this idea of building a sense of community. So therefore it becomes incumbent upon the educators to find out the cultural backgrounds of their students. The article says that culture is a phenomenon that goes in two ways and talks about the fact that teachers have a culture and that students have a culture. I added this third way that we need to be aware of when it comes to culture, and that schools also have a culture, and it's usually reflected but from the values of the dominant culture as well. So we need to be aware of these three ways that culture can come into and influence the school and its stakeholders. Also, the author tells us about this idea of cultural deprivation. And what this is when we as human beings naturally value or devalue other cultures. For example, I've heard students say that they highly admire the Asian culture because they're quiet or they seem docile and smart. I've also heard these same students say that they don't understand and find problems with the African American culture because it seems loud and hostile. So automatically you can see that people unwittingly are assigning a hierarchy when it comes to culture, saying that some cultures are good, some not as good, and we place a value and we don't even realize that we're doing that. The author tells us that cultures have different ways of telling stories, rearing children. When you go into these homes, you'll find different toys and reading material. And she shares an example from a Heath study of two poor, unnamed communities. And she gives them the pseudonym of Rodeville and Tracton. And she tells us that with these two communities, even though they're poor, the difference between them is that one is white and one is a black community. And she found, the Heath study found something interesting that even though they shared the same socioeconomic status, the types of toys and reading material and things of that nature were different um, from one community to the next. That particular study done in the early 1970s has received a lot of attention and a lot of critique, if you will. The next item on our list is that we need to know that Viadero connects this idea in letting us know that good teaching is contextual. And she gives us the example by the professor by the last name of All. And All did a little study or shares an example from a Native American community in a school where the teacher valued this idea of talk stories. And what that means is that, there was this teacher who could not get certain ideas about language and these concepts across to her students. But once she used these ideas within the cultural proclivities of the students' environment and their culture, they started to learn these ideas because she was able to leverage learning based on the cultural backgrounds of the students. And I hope that makes sense for all of you, that we can really make learning happen when we pay attention to the culture that the students bring to the classroom. And we can only do this when we really believe that their culture has value. And we use that to bring concepts, ideas to life. Take a look at that example from our reading. The author tells us that value systems influence learning. Some students come from cultures that are very individualistic in nature, and some students come from cultures that are more collectivist. And so if you know the kind of cultural sort of or value leaning of your students, whether it comes from this idea that they believe in competition versus, the will of the group, that makes a difference in how they learn and how you want to set up your learning experience. For example, if a student comes from a very individualistic value orientation, then you want to maybe invite competition in the classroom. Not all the time, but respect that from that student. But if they come from a more collectivist orientation, you can do the kinds of learning activities that make the classroom feel like a home, a safe space. You can do learning communities and collaborative kinds of experiences so students get a better connection to the kinds of concepts you're sharing in class. Now, the author goes on to tell us that history systems influence learning and shares with us a couple of terms, voluntary versus involuntary immigrants, and that if we're aware of how certain cultural groups have immigrated to this country, we need to be aware that that has a huge impact in how they or how much affinity they will feel to this country and how they may interact with you as a future teacher. And the author gives us an example of the Agbu study. And for a lot of people, I don't think they realize that African Americans are considered involuntary immigrants. Although our country is 400 years old, it was founded on the concept, the institution of slavery. We had slavery in this country for 250 years. And then we had another 100 years from the late 1860s to the 1960s where we had separate but equal philosophy in this country known as segregation, and where people were treated as less than. So we now have 350 years of our 400 years of African Americans being treated as chattel, and then being told that they're less than, they can't vote or go to school with persons who are different from them. And so this idea of feeling like an involuntary immigrant can have huge implications inside your classroom. And so we need to be aware of that. And there will be a lot of resistance to this way that the dominant culture may operate. And so there's an Ogbu study that tells us of some things that we need to be aware of, and this phenomenon called acting white, whereby African American children don't want to take on the values that are considered a part of the dominant culture because they haven't felt included for many years. Where are kids getting this information from? Well, they only need to look to their grandparents and parents to find examples of mistreatment of African Americans in this country. We're the best country on earth, in my opinion, but we have a history that we need to be aware of. And knowing the history of your students can help you prepare to how to interact with them. You never let them get away with doing certain things because there's a sad history attached to them. But you use that understanding to help you create an environment where all your students feel welcome, and that you hold high expectations and you never lower your expectation for any learner regardless of the historical background that they come from. The author goes on to give us an example of village English versus formal English that we need to pay attention to. And there's also an example of an African American student expelled in Tampa. Take a look at that example as well. The author helps us to understand that there is a real need for us to learn about our students. So even though we have these understandings of how cultural groups behave, we need to understand that students are individuals, and that the information we get about cultural groups is just general information. It won't tell you anything about that individual learner. You need to get to know that learner on a one-on-one basis. You need to understand and learn who they are. The author reminds us that there's a difference between stereotyping and patterns. So when we stereotype, we make these preconceived judgments about people. And we all know stereotypes about different ethnic and cultural groups in this country, whether we're talking about our gay brothers and sisters, or our white brothers and sisters, or Asian American brothers and sisters. There's stereotypes attached to every cultural group. Most of them are not founded on anything other than people having these preconceived ideas. However, some of these ideas are actually true, but there's a difference between a stereotype and a pattern. So there are these observations that we see going on when it comes to stereotypes and patterns. The difference is that when the observations are founded on real actual fact and based on study, then we know that it is different from someone just hypothesizing or guessing, or just placing an arbitrary judgment on someone. So patterns are founded in real research and documentation. And we know at the end of the day that when we see these observations about a group, that group acts very loud or that group is docile, we can either look at that observation as something that is good, then it becomes a pattern, or we can look at it as negative, that observation. Now that observation becomes a stereotype. So it's how you perceive that observation. When it's perceived in truth and with goodness is a pattern. When it's founded on nothing and you think so often that it is devalued, then we know it is a stereotype. there are some key points that the author is trying to bring home, and that is that all kids need to feel comfortable with the classroom culture, and also that culture in classroom and the teacher is there, and we need to be aware of it. Our students have a culture, the teacher has a culture, and the classroom has a culture, and we need to be aware of it. And culture is a profound profound phenomenon that has huge implications on how a student learns. The author tells us that there are four important principles to enhancing learning for diverse learners, and concludes the reading by sharing these four principles. That we need to know that that good teaching is contextual, and that means that the way we teach perhaps in College Station is going to be different than how we might teach in Bryan. And that's okay. You have to know who the students are, you have to know their culture. So what is working in College Station that is good is not necessarily good teaching when it comes to teaching the learners in Bryan. They're different. They come from a different cultural background, not a better background, not a worse background, but a different one. The author also says we need to be explicit in our teaching, and that we can't assume that our kids understand the rules of the dominant culture that exists inside schools, because some of them may come from environments at home that's totally different from the culture at school. So we can't assume that they know. We have to explain and share the rules of school in explicit terms. We also have to share productive activities and make sure that they feel as if the activities and lessons that they're doing matter to their life. And that means finding these kinds of experiences that are applicable to students and who they are. And then the fourth principle is having meaningful conversations. And so it's a good idea to jumpstart your um, education about other cultural groups by learning about patterns that may exist about, let's say, Asian Americans versus white Americans. But that's only the starting point. We have to go deeper and find out who our students are on an individual level. And that only happens when we have meaningful two-way conversations. That's the end of our presentation. Thank you for your time, and gig 'em.